began my academic life as a physics student. I got my PhD from MIT and spent 2 years as a postdoc in Illinois, and then came to the University of Toronto. And for the first 7 years, I was a pure physicist, published over 30 papers in elementary particle physics. But I had interests outside of physics, and I began in 1971. I arrived in Toronto in '67. 1971, I started a course called The Poetry of Physics and the Physics of Poetry, which caught the attention of Marshall McLuhan. And he asked to meet me and invited me to have lunch with him at St. Michael's College. And I was very excited to have lunch with this fantastic thinker. And as soon as we sat down with our lunch, he said to me, "What have you learned in the poetry of physics?" And I said, "Well, I am actually working on the problem of trying to understand why science began in Europe, formal science began in Europe and not in China. Because the Chinese invented so many things, paper, ink, silk, porcelain, stirrups, magnetism, clockworks, the list goes on and on." Joseph Needham wrote a book called The Grand Titration, which described how ideas from China arrived in Europe and influenced the development of science. So I was trying to understand why the science began, formal science began in Europe, abstract science. And I came up with two ideas. I thought in Europe we have the idea of monotheism and the concept of codified law. The Chinese are spiritual people, but they don't have a monotheistic belief, and they have law, but it's not codified. So codified law plus monotheism gives you the idea of universal law, and that could explain why science began in Europe, abstract science. And McLuhan nodded his head in agreement and said, "It's very good, Bob, but you've forgotten one other thing, one thing that exists in Europe that does not exist in China. Can you guess what it is?" And I was unable to come up with an answer because I was intimidated by this great thinker. And I said, "I give up." And he said, "The alphabet." And I groaned. As soon as he said alphabet, I remembered how he connected alphabet to abstract science and deductive logic. And so right then and there at that lunch, we wrote a paper. And the paper was called Alphabet, Mother of Invention. And the thesis was that codified law, monotheism, alphabet, abstract science, deductive logic were 5 ideas that began in a very narrow geographic zone between the Tigris-Euphrates River and the Aegean Sea between 2000 BC and 500 BC. And that paper was published by Neil Postman, the editor of a journal called Etc. McLuhan and I had hoped to turn that into a book, but unfortunately, sadly, he passed away had a stroke in '79, passed away in 1980. So I completed the project with a book called The Alphabet Effect, which was published in 1984. After we lost McLuhan, I wanted to continue the research in communications, and the microcomputer was just coming on stream at that time. And so I decided to study the impact of computing on education. And that's how I gave birth to the books, The Fifth Language and then The Sixth Language. I realized from the study of the alphabet that the way in which you organize information influences the way in which you think. And so I began to examine language and its effect on society and the way in which language evolved. And I came up with the idea that speech, writing, mathematics, science, computing formed an evolutionary chain of languages, and that each language emerged as a result of the information overload of the previous languages. And that book was published as a fifth language in 1995. At the end of the book, I suggested that perhaps the sixth language would be the internet. And by 2000, when the publisher wanted to do another printing of the book, I told them to hold the press. I wanted to add the sixth language of the internet. And that became the book called The Sixth Language. In that work, what I made use of was something called complexity theory. Because every time you have an information overload, you get a chaotic situation. And what often happens with chaotic situations is that the system self-organizes and there emerges a new level of order. So, for example, when in Sumer, the economic situation became very complex because they were using clay tokens as receipts for tributes that farmers would pay to the priests. The priests would take those tributes and redistribute them to the irrigation workers, because the way agriculture worked in Sumer was you had to have people that grew the vegetables, looked after the animals, which we'll call the farmers, and then there's another group that created the irrigation channels that allowed agriculture to take place. And so the idea of the tributes was to redistribute the food to the irrigation workers. Well, it became more and more difficult to keep track of all of the transactions. And because of that, writing emerged, and numerical notation. And so the very first clay tablets contain both written words and numerical notation. So writing and math emerge at exactly the same point. In order to use this symbolic form of organizing information, schools had to be organized because you had to learn the secret language of these symbols. Before that, education was always on-the-job training, apprenticeship training. With schools, you get teachers. With teachers, you get scholarship. And with scholarship, you get another information overload. And organizing that knowledge led to science, which is nothing more than organized knowledge. And so there emerges the fourth language. Now, with science-based technology, you get another level of complexity. And to keep track of all the information, you needed computers. Computers emerged in around 1870. The International Business Machine Company, IBM, helped the US government to do the census in 1870, making use of cards with holes punched in them. And that process became automated at the end of World War II, and computers emerged. The fifth language. Now, computers are extremely useful for creating data, information, papers, and now there was another information overload, and my hypothesis was that the internet emerged as a hybrid of the telephone and computers, which allowed for the distribution of all the information that was being generated by the computers. And so that was the sixth language. The next step in my intellectual evolution was trying to understand where the language of speech came from. Why do we have language? And that led me to a book called The Extended Mind, The Emergence of Language, the Human Mind, and Culture. And there, again, I make use of complexity theory. My idea was based on what I learned from McLuhan about the difference between percepts and concepts. Before we had spoken language, we communicated with mimetic language. Mimetic language is hand signals, facial gestures, body language, and non-verbal vocalizations like or So this form of communication became the cognitive lab for speech, according to Merlin Donald, the author of The Making of the Modern Mind. I said, well, if this is such a good language, why did we, mimetic communication was so good, why do we need verbal language? And again, McLuhan inspired me. Mimetic communication is purely percept-based. With the complexity of human existence, as humans developed tools, controlled fire, lived in large groups, they needed concepts in order to plan their activities. And what were our first concepts? Our first words. So let's take the word water. It's a concept. It unites our percepts of the water we drink, the water we wash with, the water we cook with, the water that falls as rain, the water we swim in rivers, lakes, oceans. And so language emerged in order for us to conceptualize, to plan. And I believe that the human mind is different than the brain. The brain is a percept operator. The mind is a bifurcation that took place when we had language. And all of a sudden, we could conceive of ideas. And that is what the human mind does, and that's what makes it different than the brain. We're the only animal that can conceptualize, and we're the only animal that has language. So I connect conceptualization with speech. So we have simultaneous bifurcation from archaic hominids, archaic Homo sapiens, to full humans. We have the bifurcation from mimetic communication to verbal communication, and we have the bifurcation from the brain to the mind, from perception to conceptualization. Well, that brings us to the year 2007, when the Extended Mind came out. What then followed was preparation for the McLuhan Centenary. And, well, also I wanted to update McLuhan's book, Understanding Media, because of the digital media. And so I wrote a book called Understanding New Media. And what I did there was I took each of the chapters that McLuhan wrote about the media of his day, and I showed how the new media, the new digital media, had changed each of these media. And then I wrote new chapters on the media that he never had a chance to observe. So in the first part of the book, I look at how movies, telephone, radio, print were all changed by digital media. Second part of the book, what I do is I look at the media that he never had a chance to observe. So the internet, the web, blogs, wikis, cell phones, smartphones. That was a book that came out in, I guess, 2010, called Understanding New Media. 2010 was a good year for me. 2010 was a good year for me because I also finally got a chance to publish my book, The Poetry of Physics, which was published by World Scientific out of Singapore. Then became the preparation for the centenary of Marshall McLuhan's birth. He was born July 21st, 1911. I organized a festival that ran for 1 week, July 18th through the 24th, and which we had events every evening. And to prepare for that festival, and also for the various invitations I received to give keynote addresses at various other celebrations, I wrote a paper which is now a book called McLuhan Misunderstood, Setting the Record Straight. I was privileged to come to Barcelona, which was a great joy for me, to visit Pompeu Fabra and the Universitat Alberto Catalunya, and reacquaint myself with my many friends in Barcelona. In preparation for those talks, I, by the way, also talked in Edmonton, Winnipeg, New York, Bologna, Copenhagen, and Brussels. It was a really busy year. The paper that I wrote, called McLuhan Misunderstood, Setting the Record Straight, developed the following hypothesis: that the reason McLuhan's was so hard to read was that he was not writing for an audience. He was writing for himself. It was just a way to explore ideas. He received a letter from a young man that said, Professor McLuhan, when you write letters to the editor, they're very clear, but then when I read your books, it's very difficult. Why is that? And McLuhan said, oh, when I write a letter to the editor, I am doing exposition. I'm taking ideas that are well known and describing them. When I write my books, I'm in exploration mode. I'm trying out new ideas.